Welcome to Fat Chicks on Top. This podcast contains frank discussions about the body, sexuality, and occasionally uses swear words, which may not be appropriate for people under the age of 18. This podcast also uses facts, statistics, and mathematics, which may not be appropriate for liberal arts majors. And this podcast relies on science and reality, which may not be appropriate for evangelicals. Welcome to Fat Chicks on Top. This is your host, Auntie Vice. I'm here with Azyad. He is a BDSM coach. He's written several books, including BDSM, a guide for explorers of extreme eroticism. He is based out of Italy, and he's been in the kink world for quite some time now. So it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. You all make me feel quite ancient, isn't it?
You know, as I bear down on 50, I feel quite ancient in the community too. But
just starting out.
It's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is being older and having been somebody who got involved way, way, way before 50 Shades, right? Because we've had this huge influx in the last decade or so. You come from a different perspective. And for those who listen to the show on a regular basis, you know, I've had a couple of folks on who've been in the kink community for a while. When did you find the kink community? How did you find it? Because it's not like today where you just go on the interwebs and you find everything.
Yeah, it was quite different, actually. So what my story is that I found out very, very early that sadomasochistic imagery was kind of interesting for me. I absolutely didn't know why, but it was very used in the political counterculture comics of the 70s here in Europe. So even if the meaning of those pictures was totally different, I found there was something interesting. So the little nerd that I was, even at that time, I tried to find out more and more and more. And when I finally got 18, I could finally go to a newsstand and buy my first BDSM magazine. It was rather easy because there was just one here in Italy. It was called Club. And it was actually sold in all of the 37 newsstands all over the country. So very, very difficult to find it. Luckily, I was in Milan, so we had a couple of those newsstands around here. And, I started to see a different perspective on bad evil sadomasochism as it was depicted by the media, of course. That was the first time I read something about consent. The SSC motto hadn't even started spreading. And, I wanted to know even more. Meeting people was very close to impossible because we had personal acts by mail, and just the time required to get in touch with somebody could easily go into the months. 6 months was rather common, and you usually ended up very disappointed by the meeting, by the way. But anyway, on this magazine, they had an advertisement for the only club in the whole of Europe that opened just 2 nights a year for non-members, and which was totally about BDSM. The club was the Doma Club in Den Haag in the Netherlands. And so in a time when there were no low-cost flying, There was very high language barriers and so on. This 18-year-old kid actually went all over there to the north, and for the longest time of 3 hours, I could finally experience the community. And it was so nice. It was, as you probably have heard before, just like finding home.
Mm-hmm.
And for the longest time, I kept commuting to Den Haag to experience that, where I met another guy rather frequently from Italy. And we didn't even talk the first times, but in the end, we just had to. And I said, where are you from? From Milan. And what about you? I'm from Milan as well. So why don't we meet there? It's much easier.
Yeah.
But of course, there was nothing. And little by little, with the help of the newfangled internet, we managed to build something, not just us, of course. There were other groups, other people all over the country. And we finally managed to build our first BDSM party in Milan, which is still running, by the way, 18 years later. And that is basically the story.
That's amazing. So you grow up in Italy, and that has a very different culture around sexuality. You know, in the U.S., we're
yes.
very locked down, very conservative, and it's long been a battleground of what we teach in school, who's allowed to say what. What was it like growing up? What messaging did you get around sexuality, if any, growing up in Italy?
Oh, well, what you have to remember is that Italy is a very big province around the small Vatican. We really felt, especially in those times, the influence of the church and of its obscurantism. It was very much a political fight against, changing the status quo. Italian politics is a very perverse topic we won't dwell on today. And but basically, it all amounted to you don't get any education at all, unless you are a very bad, we called them communists, but they were in fact socialists. If you had access to counter-information, counterculture, and some of that even bled into the mainstream. You want to check out one television show from, I believe, 1980, something like that, called The Strix, S-T-R-Y-X. That was very, very controversial. It was the first show in prime time with full frontal nudity, and it was basically a pastiche of a satanic ritual with transsexual performance and stand-up comedians standing up the government and so on. It lasted for all of 2 episodes, actually, but it gave us, to the whole country, an idea of a very different way of experiencing the body, sexuality, and relationships.
Is there still that very strong connection between politics and sexuality, where embracing things like BDSM is also considered politically counterculture? Or do you actually have conservative folks now coming in since it's much more accessible?
Oh, yes, we have, absolutely. As a matter of fact, for a very long time, BDSM, or sadomasochism, as it was called in that age, was mostly equal to fascism in the public view. Of course, it wasn't at all, but yes, it is a battleground still. Maybe not as much as transsexuality, or gay rights in general. Mostly thanks to 50 Shades right now, but But yes, of course, there are entire political parties that live on being contrary to something. And from time to time, that something is a different way of experiencing sexuality, a freer way. But yes, as a matter of fact, it is very probable right now that our next government will be extremely far right, and everybody's very scared about that because they are already speaking of curbing gay rights and so on, and the election times haven't even started yet. So you can just imagine.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few countries aiming more and more far right now as a response to people trying to be more open and embracing. And Italy's not exempt from that. In the US, we've just started the dialogue around monkeypox, and it's being treated very much like the early ages of the AIDS pandemic of, well, this just affects gay men, so we can be a little slower in the response. It doesn't really matter if they're dying. Italy was closer to some of the original outbreaks in Europe. How is it going there with monkeypox? What's the dialogue like there?
Well, there isn't much, but I'm glad to inform you that today Italy started the vaccination, an opportunity for vaccination here in Milan, which is one of the major cities, and unfortunately the epicenter of the infection right now. We have a grand total of 2 slots for vaccination per day. So, wow. Well, I believe it's actually not a political decision, but due to availability of the vaccine. Mm-hmm. But yes, it is rather scary, especially because the very people who are currently more at risk are just ignoring it. Unfortunately, there is a rather clear, what's the word? I'm sorry, sometimes my English isn't very good. A kind of superposition of the LGBT people and Novax people. And, there's pretty much the equivalent of MAGA in your country. Mm-hmm. And this really doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. What does today's BDSM scene look like in Europe? I mean, you went from having one club, in the entire continent, and just from the conferences I've applied to and gone to, I mean, there's a lot more going on. So what does it look like today?
Absolutely. Things have really, really changed pretty much all over Europe. And, well, of course, the pandemic changed everything. So my information might not be up to date, but we have very big scenes in the UK, for example, the north of Europe, Germany and Netherlands and so on, have always been very much open about sexuality and alternative sexualities as well. But I must admit that even Southern Europe, which has historically been more conservative, a little bit backwards on these subjects, has really took up the gap. And for example, here in Italy, especially in northern Italy, we really have a brilliant scene with stuff to do every day, multiple parties, multiple courses. I believe we are actually in a very good times for this.
What spurred you to start writing about it? Not just playing, but actually writing about BDSM. What spurred you to write the books?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was a very normal journalist up to the change of a millennium, when a very big editorial crisis, publishing crisis hit. And I found myself without a job. So I took a sabbatical year, and pretty much immediately I got so bored I had to find something to do. And that something was, we're talking about, the year 2000, to collect all the information I had collected all over the time into one book that I thought nobody would have ever read. Well, as it turned out, it is now in its fifth edition. It's a very big very big seller, and I keep receiving messages from readers telling me I have saved them. They finally know they are no monsters. They finally gave a name to their kinks, and when it came the time to decide what to do with my professional life, I could choose between going back to regular journalism and basically selling hate to people, hate and fear, or keep doing this and telling people how to better enjoy their lives. It was rather easy as a choice, as a matter of fact. And maybe it is not as good financially, but it keeps me healthy and happy. So I wrote more and more books, and a couple of them are even available in English right now, one in Spanish as well. And, well, what can I say? This is what makes me happy.
How was it received by family and friends when you went from being a journalist into, I'm going to work in kink, especially in a more conservative area of the world?
Yes, this has been interesting. Well, I didn't even have the talk with my family. I'm a very reclusive person on that side, but with friends, I expected the worst. And lo and behold, only 2 persons have ever stopped being my friends for this choice. All the other were or uninterested or just okay with that. The real problem was with the families of my partners. They really could have a really hard time understanding this. So I kept a kind of double life for a while, but I'm finally open with everyone about this. So if you don't hear any more from me just after the election, you know what happened.
Yeah, that's one of the things, in talking to, I've had somebody on from South Africa, doing a show later today with people from Australia. That is a real fear around the world of this next election in various countries, which is coming up in the next 1 to 2 years, depending on where folks are at. There's quite a bit of fear about, for anyone in alternative communities, what's going to happen. Are there groups in Italy organizing around the potential backlash from a right-wing win?
I'm afraid not. As a matter of fact, the activism about alternative sexualities in general is mostly a social network thing, a kind of posing to show you are very progressive and so on, but there isn't much actual activity about that. Now, to be very honest with you, yes, there is some fear about backlash, but at the moment it doesn't seem too much of an actual risk. I mean, even in very, very conservative countries like Hungary, for example, where homosexuality is actually a crime, right now, the kink scene is still alive and kicking, and maybe a little less conspicuous, but running on. And well, we have to see what will happen, of course. But I wouldn't be so scared, mostly because sex isn't serious for people in power. How they are wrong.
Yeah, it's so fundamental, and yet, so many folks in politics like to pretend it doesn't exist. It's not a real thing until they get caught.
Yeah, unless you call your name is Berlusconi, and pretty much all of your life is colored by that. But
So, growing up in a country that's so predominantly Catholic, how did that influence your kink?
In a pretty good way, I believe. I know this sounds unusual and popular, but we are very, very big on guilt and on taboos, and that can become a kind of fuel for your kink. It puts that duende into it. I don't know whether you're familiar with the word duende.
I don't know the translation of it, but I get it's kind of used the way the French use joie de vivre. It's that spice that
yes, it's actually an Andalusian from Spain. And I believe there is no translation for that, but it's described as the dark and forbidden that gives spice to life and sex in particular. Yes.
When you bring that up, so you and I came into a kink scene when it was really much less regulated by the community around consent, and now there's multiple models of consent, and that's so much in the fore and talking about trauma-informed sex and triggers and all of these things. And for better or worse, it's a different. This generation has a very different approach. How do you see that affecting kink in general? Is putting so much emphasis on explicit communication, and I mean, there's now multiple page negotiation kits for people. Like for you and I, it was like, you want to be hit? I want to hit you. Cool. We're good. Like that was about the level of negotiation when I came into the scene. So
pretty much so, yes.
How do you see this affecting kink and BDSM?
Well, I'm very ambivalent about that. Because yes, things have changed, of course, and it is our fault as well. As educators, we really pushed the technique and consent and rights and everything else, and I believe we were right in doing so, because the kind of non-communication we had in our early times could actually become rather dangerous at times, not often, but it did. What I'm a bit afraid of is the lack of that duende we were talking about just a moment ago. What I see is people going for the sensory experience of that. But it, especially among younger people, it often tends to remain on a surface level. And I believe it's a pity, because they don't even taste what the splendid power and intensity it can be about. For some time, I asked people about transcendence. Where is the transcendence in what you do? And most of them couldn't even understand the question, which is probably my fault, of course. But, as with everything else, things are kind of on a swing, going from one extreme to the other. And hopefully the pendulum is swinging back, and we'll be able to find a midpoint where we have both safety, communication, respect, and passion in what we do.
When you teach and when you coach, how do you encourage people to get in touch with that deeper passion?
Mostly through example, just by mentioning the fact that kink can be something more complex and deep than most people think right now. And I happen to start a conversation with somebody on a very small subject and realize they have completely no idea of what they are even doing. Maybe they're doing very elaborate kimbaku for the aesthetics of it, without even understanding the communication between the partners through the ropes. Or they do polyamory with a dozen partners, and they don't know how to talk with each other. So just mentioning there is another way of experiencing all of this, which is not the right way, of course. It's just one way. Really does wonders. Now the problem is, old curmudgeon that I am, to make people listen. But I have the means for that. No, seriously. People are so keen on experiencing new stuff and checking out the boxes, the bucket list, that they don't even time to listen and to explore a deeper way of experiencing that. But it just takes a little, will and to do that.
When was the first time you experienced kink could be transcendent?
Oh, well, that actually was right at the start of my personal experience, when I still was on the other side of the whip. I was a sub, especially because nobody would ever submit to a nerdy 17-year-old kid. And I experienced a fisting, and I actually experienced at the same time what Buddhists describe as the unity of everything in the universe. I remember I didn't even feel any physical sensation, but the power of this energy flowing through everything. And I actually was so shocked about that. It was like I don't know, maybe an LSD experience. I never did. I never did drugs, so I don't know. But I came out of that experience with a totally different understanding of the world, and that pushed me to learn more.
I think that's what's missing from so many of the people I've talked to, the descriptions of what they do. They can list the things they do, but that emotional, spiritual, energetic connection to it it's a small group of people that still seek that aspect of kink out. You travel a fair amount and everything. Where do you find communities that center it more on the holistic experience of kink, and not just saying, well, I've done this and this, and doing that tick box list?
Right. I believe that there is just to make one example among many, there is a group based in Berlin called Explore, founded by choreographer Felix Rockert. And they do this Explore festival, where they have lots and lots of practical workshops around what they call insecurity, going outside of your comfort zone in a controlled way. And it is mostly about eroticism and sex, but not just that. And so there you can find this kind of transcendence from time to time. But then again, I believe there is a real separation between this kind of scene, which is more, I don't know, new agey, maybe, or more spiritual, and the proper kink community, which is more about technique and posing and showing off and so on, at least here in this country. And so they just don't talk. And there is a real pity. I had the same kind of experience many, many years ago when I first went to a sexology convention. I was actually introduced on the lectern as, and now the perverted one. It was kind of scary, just like being a little kitten among Rottweilers. But but what I found out very, very quickly was that the kind of knowledge the kink community has was totally separated by the kind of knowledge that sexologists and psychologists have. And they are equally important. But there is just this lack of dialogue between the two. And I believe there is something similar between this more spiritual scene and the more technical one, which is a terrible shame, because if people just talked with each other, they discover incredible things, I believe.
And you've done in your own work a more almost academic approach in studying kink and learning about kink. In doing that, how has it changed how you view your own kink and the way you express it?
Oh, this hurts, actually. you know what I say about sexologists? There are people who just don't have sex, but but no, seriously. Of course, having a more technical and scholar-like point of view on all of this does change the experience a bit. I also believe that all the research and seeing so many examples of people being happy, each one of them in their own different ways, also drives you to try and experience that kind of happiness. And so those sort of things probably balance out one with the other. But yes, sometimes it's maddening, for example, to see how kinksters, especially younger kinksters, go online and debate the best way of doing something, for example, without even thinking of searching online whether somebody has already explored that. So they reinvent continuously the same things, do the same errors, the same mistakes, hurt themselves in the same ways, just for this lack of historical perspective, maybe.
How do those of us who are a bit older, been in the community longer, re-inject that, connect the kink community to its history? Because it's a very rich and very deep history. And there are places around the world dedicated to cataloging and creating these collections of wonderful parts of our history. How do we bring that and make that important for this next generation so they don't lose all contact with that?
Of course, no collection, as good as it can be, is of any use if people don't look for it. So what I'm personally trying to do is to bring these insights into the current scene. For example, I organize a number of parties here in Milan, where I desperately try to put, to also shoehorn in some workshops, for example, bringing people of all ages and orientations and origins to bring their expertise on that. I try to inject some kind of curiosity by bringing in artists, visual artists, for example. But it is a really, really uphill battle. I hope I'm making sense. My English is my fifth language, so I'm probably...
No, you're
okay.
Perfect.
I mean, here in Italy, we had what I experienced as the best kink cultural event I've ever been, which was the Rome BDSM convention. It ran for, I believe, 4 years. And then it crashed down very, very badly because people just weren't interested. There is this kind of attitude, I believe, of a kind of vampiric attitude somehow, of going noticing you're horny and then go and gobble up everything available, but never giving something back to the community. If there is even a community, in many countries, there is no community at all. There is a group of people sharing the same interests, but it is not a community. And yes, maybe the need for a more circular kind of knowledge and exploration and exchanging information is what we need. I don't know how to better do this right now, but maybe you can help. And the people listening to us.
Well, and it's one of the reasons I like, one of the books you have in English is it's such a compendium of different approaches to kink, different parts of it, and deeply, deeply informative. And I think we need there's a few other books out there. Now, of course, they all slip out of my brain. But there's a number of them on like the history of the leather community, the history of leather dykes and stuff like that are out there, but they're much less read than, some of the other more lighthearted.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And they suffer from the same sin as well, which is being very partial. There are really hundreds of great books out there, but they generally are made by someone who has really feels for some kink specifically and tells you all about that, but ignores or even fights against other kinks. I believe in my books what I can really bring to the conversation is the journalistic experience. So in that compendium you mentioned, for example, there are a number of practices and situations that I really personally don't like at all. But this doesn't mean I didn't check them out and I didn't double check every source and the information and try to keep a balanced and realistic attitude about that. And maybe this is a little part of what's missing as well from the community, I mean.
Yeah, no, I agree. Is people get so slotted into very specific kinks and very specific ways of approaching kink. And then once they found one that works for them, the exploration kind of stops.
Yes.
Because they're like, I found my thing, so this is it.
Yes. The typical conversation at a party between kinks as well, you meet somebody and you ask, well, what are you into? And my answer is, I don't know, because what I can be into with you, it can be totally different from what I do with other people. And this is really upsetting to some, because, I just don't understand how people can be flexible and open to the kind of special alchemy that each, meeting brings to the scene.
I think what you hit on there too is that there's this need to be certain, which I think comes with a more conservative approach, which is more popular. This need for certainty of this is who I am. Let me give you a very clear label. And
terrible.
And the desire to explore and have something possibly go wrong is terrifying to some people.
Yes, that might be one aspect of that. Also, I believe our kink culture, globally speaking, is absolutely great, but very myopic in considering itself. I mean, we are pushing this narrative of everything's totally rosy and happy and totally safe and so on, and we are the greatest people on the planet. And of course we are. But we are also human. And so we have very disturbed people among us. So we have errors and mistakes. We have very big blunders sometimes. And it is absolutely true that Freud was wrong. We don't go into kink because we are deeply traumatized. But in my research, at least, I found out that most kinksters come from some sort of instability, which doesn't mean anything necessarily major, but what happens, I believe, is that we don't feel very okay with the society in general, and we find a different niche where we can feel more at home, as I was describing before. I probably came in that because I was a very lonely kid, for example. Nothing bad in that, but not discussing this fragility, these imperfections we have as kinksters in general. This doesn't do us any good. We should be more critical, isn't it?
Definitely. So we're coming toward the end. I am keeping an eye on time because I know it's very late in Italy right now. You have books, you have all these wonderful things. So if our readers want to connect with you, and please feel free to plug in English and then any other language, and we'll get because this is listened to in Europe and other places. So how do people find you? How do they connect with these resources that you have and connect with you? Or if they want to go to one of your parties when they're in Milan, how do they find you?
All right. So the only difficult part with this is starting and remembering how I am called, because Ayzad is not a very normal name. It's spelled Ayzad. If you add a .com to that, you end up on my website, where you can find pretty much everything I do. There are thousands of articles, a podcast, the videos, the pre-previews for my books, and so on. Search for Ayzad, Ayzad on Amazon. You'll find my books. And two of them in particular, our English public might be interested in, called BDSM, A Guide for Explorers of Extreme Eroticism, which is the compendium we were talking about. It's about 600 pages or something like that. And the other one is called I Love BDSM, which is also available in Spanish. And it is a much simpler manual for the 50 Shades folks to just, give it a more realistic description of what we are about. Then if you happen to be in Milan sometime, just look for my website again, or a website called milanokinky.com, which has a full calendar of events, not just mine. And you're very welcome to come and celebrate our coming of age for our sadistic party. It's getting 18 years old this winter, and it's going to be pretty big. I hope so, at least.
Thank you so much for being on your show. We'll have all of those links on the show notes for our readers. The books will be up on my blog, Love Letters to a Unicorn, on the resource page, because I read them. I loved them. I strongly recommend anybody interested in kink writ large, check out The Explorers of Extreme Eroticism. It's a brilliant, brilliant book, well worth adding to your library. And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor, actually, because, for small Italians coming on the international and especially the North American scene is kind of a goal reached. So thank you, really.
Excellent. Hi, this is Auntie Vice from Fat Chicks on Top. I want to let you know that Fat Chicks has a new line of merchandise so you can show your love. You can go to auntie.vice.com/shop for all things Fat Chicks. My books are there as well, and if you use code PREP4FULSOME, capitalizing each letter, you will get $7 off the 30 Days of Kinky Self-Discovery digital book. of the world. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fat Chicks on Top. Please like, subscribe, and review our podcast on whatever platform you listen to it on. If we like your review, we may even read it online. This has been an Auntie Vice production. Producer and host, Rebecca Blanton. Audio production by Sharon Smith. Music by David Manga. And more music by Sharon Smith. For more information about Fat Chicks on Top, please visit our website for all things Fat Chicks at fatchicksontop.com.